In the quiet dignity of Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio has spent 3 decades bearing witness to the full spectrum of human experience. Stories of hardship and triumph, of mistakes and redemption, of lives lived in the margins and lives touched by unexpected grace. But on this grey Monday morning in early November, an elderly woman would walk through his courtroom doors, carrying a lifetime of stories that would challenge everything he thought he understood about resilience, survival, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Her name was Mrs. Elena Kowalski, and at 87 years old, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been shaped by nearly 9 decades of living, through circumstances that most people couldn't imagine surviving even once, let alone repeatedly across the span of a lifetime. Eleanor was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and hands that showed the deep lines and age, spots of someone who had worked with those hands for most of their life. Judge Caprio immediately noticed something remarkable about Mrs. Kowalski as she slowly made her way to the defendant's stand, using a worn wooden cane for support. There was a quiet strength in her bearing that transcended her obvious physical frailty, a dignity in her posture that spoke of someone who had faced unimaginable challenges and had refused to be broken by them. Her simple navy dress was clean and carefully pressed. Her small pearl earrings were modest but elegant, and despite her age and apparent poverty, she carried herself with the grace of someone who understood that dignity was something that came from within, rather than from external circumstances. Elena had received a citation for operating a small food cart without the proper vendor license and permits. According to the court documents, she had been selling homemade pierogi and other Polish pastries from a cart outside the Providence train station, a violation of city ordinances that regulated street vending and required specific licenses and health department approvals. The fine was $350, and the citation indicated that this was not her first warning about operating without proper documentation. As Elena approached the defendant's stand, Judge Caprio could see the weariness in her eyes, not just the physical exhaustion of someone in their late 80s, but a deeper kind of tiredness that came from carrying the weight of difficult memories and ongoing struggles that would have overwhelmed people half her age. Yet there was also something undefeated in her gaze, a spark of determination that suggested this elderly woman had survived things far more threatening than a municipal court proceeding. "Good morning, Mrs. Kowalski," Judge Caprio said with his characteristic warmth and respect, immediately sensing that this case would require his most careful attention and deepest compassion. "I see you're here regarding citations for operating a food cart without proper licensing. Before we discuss the specific violations, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your circumstances?" Eleanor looked up at Judge Caprio with eyes that held decades of stories, and when she spoke, her voice carried the distinctive accent of someone who had learned English as a second language and who still carried the linguistic patterns of her native Poland. "Your Honor, thank you for asking about me as a person and not just as a number in your court," she began, her words revealing both her gratitude for being seen as a human being and her understanding that most legal proceedings didn't concern themselves with individual stories. "I am Elena Kowalski. I am 87 years old and I have been in America for 63 years, she continued, her voice quiet but steady, carrying the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime choosing words thoughtfully in a language that wasn't her native tongue. "I came to this country as a young woman, after surviving things in Europe that I spent many years trying to forget. And I have worked every day of my life since arriving here, because I learned very early that survival depends on never giving up, no matter how difficult circumstances become." Judge Caprio felt his attention sharpen as Elena spoke about surviving difficult circumstances in Europe. The timeline she had provided, arriving in America 63 years ago, which would have been around 1960, suggested that she had lived through World War II in Poland, a reality that immediately provided profound context for understanding her character and her current situation. "Mrs. Kowalski, I want to make sure I understand your situation correctly," Judge Caprio said gently, recognizing that he needed to approach this case with particular sensitivity and care. "You've been cited for operating a food cart without the proper licenses and permits. Can you help me understand why you've been selling food from a cart and what the circumstances are that led to these citations?" Helena took a deep breath, gathering herself for what was clearly going to be a difficult explanation. "Your Honor, I sell food from my cart because it is the only way I can survive," she began, her words immediately revealing the economic desperation that had driven her to operate outside the formal licensing system. "I receive Social Security benefits of $632 per month, which is not enough to pay for my apartment rent, my medications, my utilities, and food." Judge Caprio felt his heart constrict as Helena described her monthly income. $632 per month represented a level of poverty that would make even basic survival extremely challenging, particularly for an elderly person with medical needs and limited physical ability to work. The judge understood that Helena's food cart wasn't a business venture or a hobby. It was a survival strategy born of absolute financial necessity. "My rent alone is $450 per month for a small studio apartment in a building that is not very nice, but it is all I can afford," Helena continued, her matter-of-fact delivery unable to mask the harsh reality of her financial situation. "After rent, I have less than $200 for everything else: food, medicine, electricity, heat in winter, bus fare when I cannot walk. It is not possible to live on this amount, so I must find ways to make additional money." The brutal mathematics of Helena's poverty was staggering to Judge Caprio. After paying rent, she was left with less than $7 per day for all other expenses, an amount that wouldn't cover even basic necessities like food and medication, let alone unexpected costs or emergencies. The judge began to understand that Helena's food cart represented not just supplemental income, but the difference between survival and destitution. "I learned to make pierogi and other Polish foods from my mother when I was a young girl in Poland, before the war came and changed everything," Helena explained, her voice taking on a distant quality as she connected her current survival strategy to skills learned in a world that had been destroyed decades ago. "These recipes, these ways of preparing food, they are among the few things I was able to carry with me from my old life into my new life in America." Judge Caprio was struck by the poignancy of Helena's words about her recipes being among the few possessions she had been able to bring from Poland to America. The judge understood that for immigrants and refugees, particularly those who had fled war and persecution, cultural knowledge and traditional skills often represented the only form of capital they possessed in their new countries. "For many years, I worked in factories and as a cleaning lady, doing whatever work I could find that didn't require perfect English or formal education," Helena continued, painting a picture of decades spent in low-wage labor that had left her without significant savings or retirement security. "But when I became too old and too sick to do that kind of physical work anymore, I had to find another way to earn money. So I started making my mother's recipes and selling them to people who appreciate good, homemade Polish food." The entrepreneurial spirit that Helena had shown in creating a food business in her 80s was remarkable, particularly given the physical challenges of preparing food, transporting it to a selling location, and standing for hours at a cart. Judge Caprio could see that this elderly woman possessed a determination and work ethic that would have impressed him in someone half her age. "I know that the law says I need licenses and permits to sell food," Helena acknowledged, revealing her awareness that she had been operating outside legal requirements. "I tried to get the proper papers when I first started selling my pierogi 2 years ago, but the application process was very complicated, with forms in English that I didn't completely understand, fees that I couldn't afford to pay, and requirements about commercial kitchens and health inspections that I didn't know how to meet." As Helena described her attempts to navigate the licensing system, Judge Caprio could see the frustration and helplessness that bureaucratic complexity creates for elderly immigrants who lack the language skills, technological literacy, or financial resources to comply with regulatory requirements. But the judge sensed that Helena's story went much deeper than simple administrative obstacles, and that understanding her current situation would require understanding the experiences that had shaped her across nearly 9 decades of life. "Mrs. Kowalski," Judge Caprio said gently, "you mentioned that you survived difficult things in Europe before coming to America. I don't want to cause you pain by asking you to revisit difficult memories, but I think it might help me understand your current situation, if you could share a little bit about your experiences before you came to this country. Elena's expression became more serious as she prepared to discuss a past that she had clearly spent many years trying to move beyond. Your Honor, I was born in Poland in 1936, which means I was only 3 years old when Germany invaded my country and the war began, she started. Her words immediately providing crucial historical context that explained so much about her character and her approach to survival. Judge Caprio felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Elena had been a child during one of the darkest periods in human history, living through the Nazi occupation of Poland and experiencing horrors that most people only read about in history books. The judge understood that whatever had happened to Elena during those years would have left scars that lasted a lifetime. My family lived in a small village near Krakow, Elena continued, her voice taking on the flat, controlled tone that people often use when describing traumatic memories. My father was a baker. My mother helped him in the bakery and took care of me and my 2 older brothers. We were not rich, but we had enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough love. Then the Germans came and everything changed. Judge Caprio remained completely silent, understanding that Elena needed to tell her story at her own pace and in her own way, without interruption or rushed questioning. The courtroom had fallen into absolute silence, as everyone present recognized they were about to hear testimony of historical significance, a first-hand account of survival during one of humanity's darkest chapters. I was too young to understand most of what was happening at first, Eleanor explained, her words revealing the confused perspective of a child trying to make sense of violence and persecution. I remember soldiers in the streets. I remember my parents speaking in whispers late at night. I remember the fear in my mother's eyes when anyone knocked on our door. But I didn't understand why everything had become so frightening. The fragmentary memories that Elena was describing, soldiers, whispered conversations, parental fear, painted a picture of childhood innocence confronting incomprehensible evil. Judge Caprio could imagine the confusion and terror that a young child would have felt watching her safe, predictable world dissolve into chaos and danger. When I was 6 years old, the Germans took my father and my brothers away, Elena said, her voice finally beginning to crack under the weight of the memory. They came to our bakery one morning, and they took all the men and boys over 12 years old. My mother and I never saw them again. After the war ended, we learned that they had been sent to a labor camp, and that none of them had survived. Judge Caprio felt tears forming in his eyes as Elena described losing her father and brothers to the Nazi death machine. The casual brutality of the phrase, "they took them away," couldn't hide the devastating impact that such a loss would have had on a 6-year-old child and her mother, suddenly alone and unprotected in a world that had become incomprehensibly dangerous. After they took my father and brothers, my mother and I had to learn to survive on our own, Elena continued, her narrative shifting from loss to the daily struggle for existence in occupied Poland. We had no money, no food, no protection. My mother did whatever work she could find, washing clothes, cleaning houses for German officers, anything that would earn us enough to eat. The image of Elena's mother, forced to work for the occupiers who had murdered her husband and sons, was heartbreaking in its moral complexity. Judge Caprio understood that survival in such circumstances often required cooperating with the very people who had destroyed your family, a moral compromise that would have carried shame and guilt long after the practical necessity had passed. I remember being hungry all the time, Eleanor said, her words revealing the physical deprivation that had accompanied the emotional trauma of her childhood. Not just a little bit hungry, but the kind of hungry where your stomach hurts constantly and you think about food every minute of every day. My mother would give me most of what little food we had, and she would pretend she wasn't hungry so I wouldn't feel guilty for eating. The maternal sacrifice that Elena described, her mother, going hungry so that her child could eat, was a theme that would resonate throughout Elena's testimony and clearly inform her own approach to survival and work ethic. Judge Caprio could see that Elena had learned from her mother that love meant sacrificing one's own comfort for those who depend on you. When I was 8 years old, My mother became very sick, Elena continued, her narrative approaching what Judge Caprio sensed would be another devastating loss. She had developed tuberculosis from malnutrition and living in cold, damp conditions. There were no doctors who would treat poor Polish women during the occupation, and even if there had been, we had no money to pay for medicine. The description of Elena's mother dying from a treatable disease because of poverty and ethnic discrimination highlighted the compound tragedies that characterized life under occupation. Judge Caprio understood that Elena hadn't just lost her mother to illness. She had lost her to a system that valued some lives and dismissed others as expendable. My mother died when I was 9 years old, which meant I was alone in the world with no family, no home, and no way to take care of myself, Elena said, her matter-of-fact delivery of this devastating information revealing how normalized such tragedies had become during the war. For the next year, until the war ended, I survived by doing small jobs for anyone who would pay me with food, carrying water, delivering messages, helping in kitchens. The image of a 9-year-old girl navigating the dangers of occupied Poland alone, working for scraps of food and somehow surviving until liberation, was almost incomprehensible to Judge Caprio. The resilience and resourcefulness that Elena must have possessed even as a child clearly laid the foundation for the determination and work ethic she had maintained into her late 80s when the war finally ended and the Germans left. Poland was destroyed, Elena explained, her words reminding Judge Caprio that liberation didn't mean an immediate return to normalcy or security. There was no food, no jobs, no functioning government or social services. I was 11 years old, living in an orphanage with hundreds of other children who had also lost their families, and every day was still a struggle just to survive. The transition from wartime survival to post-war survival that Elena described highlighted how trauma and hardship often extended far beyond the immediate period of conflict. Judge Caprio understood that Elena's childhood had been defined not by a single traumatic event, but by years of continuous struggle, loss and uncertainty that would have shaped every aspect of her character and worldview. As Elena described her years in the orphanage, Judge Caprio could see that she was building towards something significant. In her testimony, the journey that had eventually brought her to America and the challenges she had faced in building a new life from the ruins of her past. The courtroom remained completely silent, everyone present understanding they were hearing a first-hand account of survival that deserved their complete attention and respect. I lived in that orphanage for 9 years, until I was 20 years old, Elena continued, her words revealing that her childhood had effectively ended at age 9 and that her adolescence had been spent in institutional care. During those years, I worked in the orphanage kitchen, which is where I learned more about cooking and baking. The nuns who ran the orphanage taught me that good food, made with care and love, could bring comfort even in the most difficult circumstances. The lesson that Elena had learned from the nuns about food as comfort and connection would clearly become central to her adult life and her current situation. Judge Caprio could see that Elena's food cart wasn't just about economic survival, it was about maintaining a connection to the positive lessons she had learned during her difficult years in institutional care. In 1956, when I was 20 years old, I had an opportunity to come to America through a program that helped war orphans resettle in countries that would accept them, Eleanor explained, beginning to describe the journey that had brought her to Providence. I had no family left in Poland, no reason to stay in a country that held only painful memories, so I agreed to come to America, even though I was terrified of leaving everything, familiar and starting over in a place where I didn't speak the language or know anyone. Judge Caprio was struck by the courage that Elena's decision had required, choosing to leave the only world she knew, despite its difficulties, to start completely over in a foreign country with no support system and no guarantee of success. The judge understood that such a decision represented both desperation and hope, a willingness to risk the unknown rather than accept the limitations of her current circumstances. When I arrived in America, I had one small suitcase with all my possessions, $47 that a charity had given me, and almost no English beyond hello and thank you, Elena said. painting a picture of the extreme vulnerability with which she had begun her American life. The program that brought me here helped me find a room in a boarding house and connected me with a factory that would hire immigrants who didn't speak English well. The minimal support that Elena had received upon arrival in America highlighted both the challenges faced by refugees and immigrants in building new lives and the resilience required to succeed, despite such limited resources. Judge Caprio could see that Elena's survival in America had required the same determination and adaptability that had carried her through her childhood in wartime Poland. For the next 40 years, I worked in factories, sewing clothes, packing products, assembling parts for electronics, Elena explained, describing decades of low-wage labor that had sustained her but never provided security or comfort. The work was hard and the pay was low, but I was grateful for it because I had learned during the war that work means survival, and that no honest job is beneath someone who needs to eat. The work ethic and gratitude that Elena described, born from childhood experiences of starvation and deprivation, revealed why she continued working at 87, despite physical limitations and advanced age. Judge Caprio understood that for someone who had learned to equate work with survival at age 9, the idea of complete retirement was probably incomprehensible and frightening. I never married or had children of my own, Elena continued, revealing an aspect of her life that had clearly left her without the family support system that many elderly people rely on. After losing everyone I loved as a child, I think I was too afraid to let myself love anyone that deeply again. I built walls around my heart to protect myself from more loss. But those walls also kept out the possibility of building a new family. The psychological impact of childhood trauma on Elena's adult relationships was heartbreaking to Judge Caprio. Here was someone who had been denied the comfort of family not once but twice, first through the deaths of her parents and brothers, and then through her own fear-driven inability to create new family connections in America. For many years, work was my entire life, Elena explained, her words revealing a common coping mechanism for people dealing with unresolved trauma. I worked, I came home to my small apartment, I cooked simple meals for myself, and I tried not to think too much about the past or worry too much about the future. It wasn't a happy life, but it was a stable life, and stability was something I had learned to value very highly. The modest goals that Elena had set for herself, stability rather than happiness, survival rather than thriving, reflected both her traumatic past and the limited expectations that poverty and trauma often impose on people. Judge Caprio could see that Elena had never felt entitled to comfort or joy, only to the basic security of employment and shelter. When I turned 65, the factory where I had worked for 23 years closed down, Elena said, beginning to describe the economic challenges that had characterized her retirement years. I started receiving Social Security benefits, but they were very small because I had always worked in low-wage jobs that didn't pay much into the system. I found other work cleaning office buildings at night, which I did until I was 78, and my arthritis became too severe to continue. The pattern that Elena described, working until physical disability made continued employment impossible, was common among low-wage workers who lacked adequate retirement savings or pension benefits. Judge Caprio understood that Elena's current poverty was the direct result of a lifetime spent in jobs that paid survival wages but never provided economic security. For the last 9 years, since I could no longer do cleaning work, I've been trying to survive on my Social Security benefits alone, Elena explained, bringing her narrative to her current circumstances. But every year the cost of rent goes up, the cost of medicine goes up, the cost of everything goes up, while my income stays almost the same. I watched my savings disappear, first quickly and then slowly, until there was nothing left. The erosion of economic security that Elena described would have been devastating at any age, but for someone in their late 70s and early 80s, with no ability to increase income through additional work and no family support to fall back on, such financial decline would have been terrifying. Judge Caprio could see that Elena's food cart represented a desperate attempt to prevent complete destitution. 2 years ago, when I was 85, I realized that I had a choice, Elena said, her words revealing the moment when she had decided to start her food business. I could accept that I would probably become homeless and would die cold and hungry on the streets like so many elderly people do. Or I could find a way to use the skills I had learned from my mother and the nuns to earn enough money to survive with dignity. The stark choice that Elena had faced, homelessness and death or finding a way to work in her mid-80s, was unconscionable to Judge Caprio. Here was someone who had survived the Holocaust, who had worked honestly for over 60 years, who had never asked for charity or special treatment, now facing the prospect of dying in poverty because society's safety net had failed to provide adequate support. As Elena described the impossible choice she had faced 2 years ago, Judge Caprio could see that she was approaching the emotional heart of her testimony. The elderly woman's voice had remained steady throughout her recounting of war, loss, and decades of hardship, but now there was a tremor in her words that suggested she was about to share something that touched her most deeply. "Your Honor, I need you to understand that my food cart is not just about money," Elena said, her voice taking on an intensity that commanded complete attention. "Yes, I need the income to pay my rent and buy my medicine and have enough to eat. But the cart represents something much more important to me. It represents my refusal to give up, my determination to maintain my dignity, and my connection to the people I loved and lost so many years ago." Judge Caprio leaned forward, understanding that Elena was articulating something profound about the psychological and emotional significance of work for someone who had spent her entire life equating employment with survival and dignity with self-sufficiency. "When I make pierogi using my mother's recipe, I feel connected to her in a way that I haven't felt since she died 78 years ago," Elena explained, her words revealing the deep emotional significance of her cooking. "Every time I shape the dough the way she taught me, every time I prepare the potato and cheese filling with the seasonings she used, I remember her hands guiding my small hands when I was just 5 years old, before the war came and destroyed everything." The connection between Elena's current work and her distant memories of maternal love was deeply moving to Judge Caprio. He could see that the food cart represented far more than economic survival. It was a bridge across decades of loss, a way of keeping her mother's memory alive, through the preservation of recipes and techniques that had been passed down before the war had shattered Elena's childhood. The people who buy my pierogi, many of them are Polish immigrants like me, or children of Polish immigrants who remember these foods from their own childhoods, Elena continued, describing the community connections that her cart had created. "When they taste my pierogi and they smile and tell me it reminds them of their grandmother's cooking, I feel like I'm doing something important, something meaningful. I'm not just surviving. I'm preserving a piece of cultural memory. I'm bringing comfort to people who are far from their homeland. I'm creating moments of happiness in people's difficult days." The transformation of survival work into meaningful service that Elena described revealed the dignity and purpose she had found in her food cart business. Judge Caprio could see that being able to bring joy to others through her cooking had given Elena's life a significance that mere survival could never provide. "Your Honor, I know that I should have the proper licenses and permits," Elena acknowledged, returning to the legal issue that had brought her to court. "But when I tried to get them 2 years ago, I discovered that the licensing fees alone would cost almost $400. Plus, I would need to rent commercial kitchen space because I'm not allowed to prepare food in my apartment, and that would cost hundreds more dollars every month." The economic barriers to legal compliance that Elena described highlighted a common problem faced by low-income entrepreneurs, that regulatory systems designed to protect public health often inadvertently made it impossible for poor people to operate legitimate businesses. Judge Caprio understood that Elena wasn't choosing to operate illegally out of disrespect for the law, but out of absolute economic necessity. "I spoke with several people at the city offices, trying to explain my situation, trying to find a way to comply with the regulations," Elena continued, her words revealing the attempts she had made to operate within the legal framework. "But the people I spoke with could only tell me about the rules and requirements. No one could tell me how an 85-year-old woman with $600 a month in income was supposed to pay hundreds of Dollars in fees and rent commercial kitchen space, the disconnect between regulatory requirements and economic reality that Elena described was a perfect example of how well-intentioned laws could create impossible burdens for the most vulnerable members of society. Judge Caprio could see that the licensing system had been designed without consideration for people in Elena's circumstances. "So I made a decision that I knew was technically breaking the law," Elena said, her voice carrying both regret and defiance. "I decided that survival and dignity were more important than perfect compliance with regulations that seemed designed for people with resources that I don't have. I decided that feeding myself and maintaining my independence were worth the risk of getting citations and fines." The moral reasoning that Elena was expressing, prioritizing survival and dignity over legal compliance, was exactly the kind of ethical complexity that made Judge Caprio's role as a judge both challenging and meaningful. The law said one thing, but justice and compassion demanded consideration of circumstances that the law couldn't anticipate or accommodate. "Your Honor, I want to tell you about something that happened last week that shows you why my food cart means so much to me," Elena said, preparing to share what was clearly a significant recent experience. "There was a young mother who came to my cart with her 2 small children. I could see that she was struggling financially. Her clothes were worn, the children looked hungry, and when she asked me how much the pierogi cost, I could hear the worry in her voice about whether she could afford to buy any." Judge Caprio could picture the scene that Elena was describing, and he sensed that this encounter had held special meaning for the elderly woman who had herself been a hungry child so many decades ago. "I gave her and her children pierogi for free, and I told her that I understood what it felt like to be hungry and to worry about feeding your children," Elena continued, her voice breaking with emotion for the first time in her testimony. "The woman started crying and told me that she had lost her job and was trying to feed her children on food stamps that weren't enough, and that she had been so worried about them going to bed hungry." The parallel between the young mother's situation and Elena's own childhood experiences was obvious to Judge Caprio. He could see that Elena had recognized herself in this struggling mother and had responded with the kind of generosity that her own mother had shown in giving Elena most of their scarce food during the war. "That moment reminded me why I keep working at 87, even when my body hurts and I'm so tired," Elena said, her words revealing the deeper purpose that motivated her continued labor. "It's not just about my own survival anymore. It's about being able to help other people who are struggling, about having something valuable to offer to my community, about proving to myself that I still matter, that my life still has purpose." The transformation of Elena's food cart from a mere survival strategy into a source of meaning and purpose was profound. Judge Caprio could see that taking away Elena's cart wouldn't just threaten her economic survival, it would strip away the dignity, purpose, and community connection that made her life worth living. "Your Honor, I know that $350 is not a large amount of money to many people," Elena said, addressing the fine that her citation carried. "But for me, it represents more than half of my monthly income. If I pay this fine, I will not be able to pay my rent and I will face eviction from my apartment. I have nowhere else to go, no family to take me in, no savings to fall back on." The devastating choice that the fine represented for Elena, pay the penalty and face homelessness, or refuse to pay and face additional legal consequences, was unconscionable to Judge Caprio. Here was someone who had survived the Holocaust, who had worked for over 70 years, who was trying to maintain her dignity and independence in her late 80s, now facing homelessness because she was trying to avoid starvation. Judge Caprio sat in complete silence for what felt like an eternity after Elena finished speaking, her words hanging in the courtroom air like a sacred testament to human resilience and the indomitable will to survive with dignity. In 30 years of presiding over municipal court, Judge Caprio had never been more profoundly moved or more acutely aware that he was in the presence of someone whose life represented a living connection to history, a testament to survival against impossible odds, and a challenge to every comfortable assumption about justice, law, and human obligation. When Judge Caprio finally found his voice, it was thick with emotion that he made no attempt to control or hide. Tears were streaming freely down his face as he looked at Elena with a mixture of admiration, reverence, and profound sorrow for everything she had endured. "Mrs. Kowalski," he said, his words barely above a whisper, "I need you to know that in 3 decades of serving as a judge, no one has ever humbled me more completely or taught me more about courage, survival, and the true meaning of human dignity than you have today." Elena looked up at Judge Caprio with surprise in her weathered eyes, clearly not expecting such a response from someone in judicial authority. Throughout her long life, her interactions with official institutions had rarely been characterized by compassion or understanding, and she had come to court expecting formal judgment rather than human recognition. What you have survived, what you have endured, and how you have maintained your humanity and compassion despite everything you've experienced. These things are beyond my ability to fully comprehend or adequately honor, Judge Caprio continued, his voice breaking with emotion as he struggled to find words worthy of Elena's testimony. "You are not just a defendant in my courtroom. You are a witness to history, a survivor of humanity's darkest chapter, and a living example of resilience that should inspire us all." Judge Caprio stood up from his chair, a gesture of respect that surprised everyone in the courtroom, but felt entirely appropriate given the extraordinary nature of Elena's story. Walking around his desk to stand directly in front of the elderly woman, he looked at her with the reverence one might show to a national hero or a saint. "Mrs. Kowalski, these citations are hereby dismissed in their entirety," Judge Caprio announced, his voice ringing with the moral authority of someone making a decision based not on legal technicalities, but on fundamental human decency. "You will not pay 1 penny in fines. Not today, not ever. And anyone who says otherwise will have to answer to me personally." The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, with many people openly crying as they witnessed this moment of perfect justice. Eleanor herself seemed overwhelmed by the response, her hands trembling as she clutched her worn cane and struggled to process the unexpected compassion she was receiving. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Reaching into his wallet, he pulled out all the cash he had, several $100s, and pressed it into Elena's weathered hands, despite her protests. "Mrs. Kowalski, this is not charity," he said firmly, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who would not be argued with. "This is a debt that we as a society owe to you for failing to provide adequate support for someone who has given so much and survived so much." Elena looked down at the money in her hands, tears now flowing freely down her lined face. "Your Honor," she said, her accented voice breaking with emotion, "I came here today expecting judgment and punishment. I never expected to find kindness and understanding. You have given me something more valuable than money. You have given me the feeling that my life matters, that my struggles have been seen, that I am not invisible." Judge Caprio felt his own heart breaking at Elena's words, realizing how desperately this elderly woman had needed to be acknowledged and valued by the society she had worked so hard to become part of. "Mrs. Kowalski, you are not invisible," he said with fierce conviction. "You are one of the most remarkable people I have ever had the privilege to meet." Furthermore, Judge Caprio continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone making commitments that would extend far beyond this single court appearance, "I am going to personally contact the city's licensing office and work with them to create a path for you to operate your food cart legally, with fees waived and requirements adjusted to accommodate your circumstances. You should not have to choose between following the law and surviving." The promise that Judge Caprio was making to use his influence to change the very systems that had failed. Eleanor represented something unprecedented. He was essentially committing to becoming Elena's advocate within the bureaucracy, ensuring that regulatory requirements wouldn't continue to threaten her survival and dignity. "I'm also going to contact several charitable organizations that help elderly residents with housing, costs and medical expenses," Judge Caprio added, demonstrating that his compassion extended beyond this single legal matter to Elena's broader needs. "You should not be living on $600 a month after everything you've contributed to this community and everything you've survived." Elena's expression showed both gratitude and a lifetime of self-reliance, struggling against the acceptance of help. "Your Honor, I have spent my whole life taking care of myself and never asking for charity," she said, her voice carrying both pride and vulnerability. "It is very difficult for me to accept help, even when I need it desperately." Judge Caprio nodded with understanding. "Mrs. Kowalski, I respect your independence and your pride," he said gently. "But accepting help when you need it isn't weakness. It's wisdom. You've spent your entire life surviving alone because you had no choice. Now you have a choice, and I'm asking you to choose to let your community support you the way you've supported others through your cooking and your generosity." The reframing that Judge Caprio offered, accepting help as wisdom rather than weakness, seemed to resonate with Elena, who nodded slowly as she considered this new perspective on her situation. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Elena asked, her voice taking on a formal tone that suggested she had something important she wanted to share. "I want to tell you and everyone here about something I learned as a little girl during the war, something that has stayed with me for 80 years, and that your kindness today has reminded me of." Judge Caprio nodded encouragingly, sensing that Elena was about to share wisdom earned through her lifetime of survival and suffering. "When I was in the orphanage after the war, one of the nuns told me something that I never forgot," Elena began, her voice carrying the weight of remembered wisdom. "She said that we survive not just through our own strength, but through the kindness of others. She said that accepting help with grace is as important as offering help with generosity, because when we allow others to help us, we give them the gift of feeling useful and connected to something larger than themselves." The lesson that Elena shared revealed a sophisticated understanding of community and human connection that transcended simple self-reliance. Judge Caprio could see that this elderly woman, despite decades of surviving alone, understood the importance of mutual support and interdependence. "So I will accept your help, Your Honor, not because I am weak, but because I understand that we are all connected, and that sometimes allowing others to help us is the most generous thing we can do," Elena concluded, her words demonstrating the grace and wisdom that had allowed her to survive and maintain her humanity despite everything she had endured. As Elena prepared to leave the courtroom that day, supported by several community members who had been moved by her story and wanted to offer assistance, she turned back one final time to address Judge Caprio. "Your Honor, you asked me at the beginning about my circumstances. I told you about my poverty and my struggles, but I want to tell you about my wealth as well." Judge Caprio looked at Elena with curiosity, wondering what wealth she could possibly be referring to, given her obvious financial poverty. "I am wealthy in memories of love from my mother and father," Elena said, her voice strong despite her tears. "I am wealthy in the skills and recipes they taught me. I am wealthy in the knowledge that I have survived things that would have broken weaker people. I am wealthy in the customers who smile when they taste my food. And today I am wealthy in the kindness you have shown me, which has restored my faith that goodness still exists in the world." The definition of wealth that Elena offered, measured in memories, skills, resilience, and human connection rather than money, profoundly moved everyone present. Judge Caprio realized that this elderly woman, who had nothing in material terms, possessed riches that most people never acquire regardless of their financial status. Judge Caprio would carry Elena's story with him for the rest of his life, using it to remind himself that behind every citation, every violation, every technical infraction, there exists a human being whose story deserves to be heard and whose dignity deserves to be honored. Elena's testimony had transformed his understanding of justice from mere application of rules to recognition of the complex circumstances that shape human behavior, and the moral obligation to respond with compassion when law and human need come into conflict. The story of Elena Kowalski's appearance in Providence Municipal Court would be shared millions of times around the world, inspiring people to look beyond surface circumstances to recognize the humanity in every person they encounter, to understand that survival often requires choices that may violate technical rules but honor deeper human values, and to remember that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in who we are and how we treat others. Elena's heartbreaking story of survival had become a gift to everyone who heard it, a reminder that human resilience, dignity, and compassion can endure even through the darkest chapters of history and the most challenging circumstances of old age.